Hello, welcome to North Country History. I'm Rob Berg, and I'll be your guide for this adventure in the forest history of the Great Lakes. This week, we head to Hartwick Pines State Park, which is a very special place for me. I hold it dearly in my heart. It's located outside of Grayling, Michigan, and Hartwick Pines is home to the largest stand of old-growth white pine in the Lower Peninsula. Today, we welcome our first guest to the podcast, historian Hillary Pine, to talk about the special place. Settle in, sit back for this week's episode of North Country History with Rob Berg. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. So welcome, Hillary. Thanks for appearing here on the podcast. As I mentioned, you are my first guest. So let me introduce you to our listeners. Hillary Pine is a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. She is the Northern Lower Peninsula Historian for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources Michigan History Center. Hillary is responsible for the Hartwick Pines Logging Museum, the Higgins Lake Nursery, the Michigan Civilian Conservation Corps Museum, and coming soon, the Learning Commons at Gitche Michike de Minising, heart of the Great Turtle Island. Did I pronounce that correctly, Hillary?
Yeah. Gitche Michike diminishing. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, this is a first for me. Hillary lives in St. Ignace with her husband, daughter, and two cats. She especially enjoys sharing Michigan's real stories with the public. So thank you, Hillary. Thanks for being on the podcast. And today we're going to talk about Hartwick Pines State Park. Most of the listeners know that I had kind of your position. It's changed a bit for 15 years, 1998 to 2013. And I left. I think there was one person in between myself and you. And then you came on. What year did you come to Hartwick Pines?
2016.
2016. So yeah, about 3 years.
Yeah.
And that was the year I moved from Northern Michigan back down here to the Southeast Michigan. So why don't you give a little bit of an overview of Hartwick Pines State Park, where it's at, so people can find it if they want to visit, and what's there, and why is it a state park?
Yeah. So Hartwick Pines State Park is very conveniently located just off I-75, whether you're going north or south. We are just north of Grayling, and we're about, 2 miles or so off of I-75. So it's a super convenient place if you're looking to stretch your legs during a long road trip. And we have several miles of hiking trails. The park itself is almost 10,000 acres. So we are the fifth largest Michigan state park. And whether you're looking to, camp, spend several days there, explore everything, we do have a modern campground. And with full hookup sites. The electric has been upgraded this fall. So if you have a big rig with all your bells and whistles, you have upgraded electric for that. And but yeah, like I mentioned, several miles of hiking trails. We do have groomed cross-country ski trails in the winter and winter events as well, guided snowshoe hikes, lanternlit hikes. And in the summer, you can hike, mountain bike on some of our trails, and there are 2 lakes where you can do some fishing. They're not swimming lakes, unfortunately, but you can do some fishing there. And as you mentioned in your intro, the old growth forest. So we do our most popular trail that most people come to see is, of course, the old growth trail. And that is 1.25 miles. It's all paved. So if you have, a stroller, a wheelchair, you can utilize that trail. And I would say vast majority of our day users, that's what they're coming for. They come to the visitor center, they park, use our restrooms, check out what we got going on in the visitor center. Our exhibit hall is going to be updated really soon. So If you have visited in the past and think, oh, I've been there, done that, uh, you know, probably 2026 and beyond, I definitely encourage you to stop in again because things will be new. But yeah, park at the visitor center, walk the old growth trail, just a mile and a quarter round trip, and check out the logging museum, which is also along the trail. So of course, I'm the historian for the park, but I'm also the historian responsible for the logging museum. So I always want visitors to check that out. We get a lot of, I might call them, day users or nature enthusiasts, birders. I think a lot of our park visitors tend to be nature-minded folks. And we just want to be encouraging of the park's history. And of course, Northern Michigan and Michigan's huge logging history. And so you can learn so much about that in just a very quick visit into the logging museum, which again is very conveniently right on the old growth trail. Throughout the summer, we have interpretive programs going on, whether you want to take a guided hike on the old growth trail, learn about some mushrooms, or maybe we're doing historic cooking at the logging museum, and you can see what types of foods the lumberjacks might have been eating in the 1890s. So lots of stuff going on. Just really depends on the day.
Well, great. Yeah, it's a great place, and I still come up frequently, as you know. And a lot of times, I don't even make it to the visitor center. I'll park at the day use area, the picnic area, and I'll walk in from there. I'll go out along on the Mertz Grade trail, which is one of the other trails that kind of juts off of the old growth trail, and just kind of stand in awe underneath some of the pines. It's beautiful. And of course, when I was employed there, I knew some of the places where you could sneak off into the woods there and find some majestic trees to kind of just kind of be by yourself. And of course, you don't encourage visitors to do that because then there's trails all over. So maybe I shouldn't have said that I just did that.
Well, uh, no, not in the summer. We do not.
Yeah.
We want people to stay on the trail. No, for
Yeah.
many reasons, we don't want people to go off trail. But in the winter, when it's snowy, that is the only time of year we really say it's okay. Go off trail. If you have your snowshoes on, go off trail. Get up close with some of the big trees. In fact, coming up this Saturday, and we have another one, February 22nd. I don't want to misspeak. I think that's the right date, with a couple of guided snowshoe hikes. And you're with a guide, you're with myself and with our park interpreter. So you're learning some nature facts, some history stuff, but we take you to some of the big trees that we know about. So that's a really cool opportunity for people that, if you're one of those people in the summer, like, oh, I want to go see that tree, you can do it in the winter.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is great snowshoeing up there. I helped lead snowshoe hikes as well during my time working with Craig, the park interpreter who you mentioned, and he'll be a guest on the podcast here soon as well. I'll have him talking about wildlife in the forest, one of Craig's specialties. So not just Hartwick Pines, but in the forest here in Michigan. But yeah, so it's fantastic, and I'm planning on coming up in February. It'll be midweek, but it'll be that same week as your next snowshoe or your February snowshoe hike. And hopefully you'll have enough snow that I can use my snowshoes. Last year when I came up in February, there wasn't any snow. So I know how things are fickle now in Michigan. We have no snow to speak of down here in Chelsea right now. So I'm jealous of my time living up in Grayling. You mentioned the logging museum and some of the logging history. So I know that Hartwick Pines is tied very closely to the logging industry and the local logging industry in the area, the Salling, Hanson and Company. Can you talk a little bit about the tie-in between that company and the park, and and really of kind of how the old growth forest came to be as one of the few remaining forests.
Yeah, and that is a very interesting story. And you really need to start out with a woman named Karen Hartwick. And she lived, like, I forget her exact birth year, but 1870s through I think 1952 is when she passed. And of course, Hartwick is her married name. She was born Karen Mickelson, and often called Bessie. And she grew up in Grayling. She was born and grew up in Grayling, went to high school there. And her father is a man named Nels Mickelson. And he had many logging interests, as most of them did. A person you might call a lumber baron, lumber tycoon. He had multiple logging interests and companies, but one of the main companies he was partner in is the Salling and Hanson Logging Company. And I know his name is not in the title, but he was a main partner. And so Karen, that's how she grew up. She grew up uh, around the lumbering business. Of course, Grayling was a huge lumbering town. So she grew up knowing about this business. Her family, of course, that's how they're making their money. And they were quite well off. So she knows about this business her whole life. And when she is in high school, she is going to school with a young man named Edward Hartwick. So you see where this is going, I'm sure, with his last name being Hartwick, that they fall in love, they get married, and but an interesting part of that story is that Edward, in the beginning, he is not in the lumber business. He is a military man. Out of high school, he goes to West Point, and he graduates from West Point. He's appointed a lieutenant of a company of Buffalo soldiers, actually, and he ends up fighting in the Spanish-American War. He's at the battle, that most of us know, Teddy Roosevelt for Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. So we know that Teddy Roosevelt and Edward Hartwick knew each other, which is just a fun fact. And after the war, when the Spanish-American War ends, they move to the Southwest. So Edward and Karen are married. They moved to where Edward is stationed in the Southwest of the United States. And I have never seen why. I don't know if you have, Rob, but I've never seen why they choose to leave. So Edward resigns his commission. And of course, it's not wartime. There's not really room for promotion to get a raise. There's no upward movement when it's not wartime. Plus, I can't imagine being two kids, young. They're probably still in their early 20s at this point, and two kids from northern Michigan living in the southwest of the United States. That's got to be such a change, for the climate. Karen was probably like, no, you're not going to make more money. Like, let's go home.
Well, to interject there, I was a bit of a military historian for a while, and I do know a little bit about, yes, peacetime advancement in the military, and the Army especially at that time, was very slow. And yeah, Edward was, I think this is 1899, so he's not early 20s anymore. He was born in 71, so I think he was about 28 at that time. And yes, Karen was a little bit younger. I'm not sure exactly which offhand either. But yeah, he was a second lieutenant still, which is still the lowest rank. And he'd been in the Army for 5 years at that point, and had no advancement even after serving in Cuba. And yes, alongside of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. In fact, I'm a Teddy Roosevelt nut, and he mentions Lieutenant Hartwick in his memoir, The Rough Riders, about his time in the Spanish-American War. So they did know each other. How well, I don't know, but he did mention Hartwick, and then Hartwick actually disagreed with something that he wrote, that that Theodore Roosevelt wrote, and commented to him, and I'm sure you've read the Hartwick biography that was written, and there's a mention in there of Edward Hartwick disagreeing with Theodore Roosevelt on there. I thought that was pretty funny.
I
But
know.
yeah, I think, he probably saw that he could be a lieutenant for a very long time into his 40s. That was not uncommon. And so, yeah, I'm betting Nels Mickelson offered him a chance to get into the lumber industry at that time because, well,
Mhm.
I'm not going to steal your thunder there. And so probably the inducement of a good job, civilian job,
Mhm.
probably. And I suspect, yes, being a young wife, Karen, moving around post to post with her husband probably was not very attractive to her. And
Yeah,
wives have a little bit of a say.
yeah, and you have to remember Karen grew up, fairly well off, and then she's in, at some fort and living in officers' quarters, and it probably was nothing like she was used to. The amenities and the finances she was used to. And just to backtrack a little bit, Karen, we don't want to forget that, Karen is a very smart young woman. She went to college while Edward's away. And I don't know that she graduated, but she did do some college, which at the time in the 1890s, like that's pretty remarkable for, a single young woman to go off, move away from home, and go to college. So uh, that's very impressive for her. And she does serve as the secretary for the Salling and Hanson Company for a short time as well. So she was working for her father's company. But by the time they move back to Grayling, Edward does work for his father-in-law in the lumbering industry. And at some point, Edward goes off on his own. So he starts his own venture. Eventually, they move down to Jackson. And what is it? It's the Hartwick, is it the Woodfield?
I
Is that
believe
the
so. I think you're right
Hartwick
on that one.
Woodfield
Yeah.
Lumber Company? So they have he has a partner and they have this lumber company based in Jackson, and they do fairly well. And then they do have a house in Detroit. I don't know exactly what year they moved, but it's this huge list of things Edward's involved in Detroit. He's just this real citizen of the city, and he's involved in the what we would call today YMCA, but looked a little different back in like
Hmm.
1912, Young Men's Christian Association, and uh, a little bit he's on like involved in bank stuff and tons of different clubs. So people know him
Yeah.
in Detroit. He's involved in a whole lot, and yeah, and they're fairly well off. I think. I don't know exactly. I've never seen their finances, but I assume, money wise, they were doing much better than they would have if he had stayed in the military.
Yeah, they had besides the company in Jackson, he had another company right there in Detroit, which I believe is the reason why they moved to Detroit and kind of centered his businesses there. And yeah, he was, like you said, he was a bit of a mover and shaker, not at the level of Henry Ford or, the automobile titans, but he kind of ran in their circles there. And I
Mhm.
know he was a member of the Detroit Athletic Club.
Oh,
When
yes.
I had your position, had a writer for their in-house publication, the DAC, came up and did an article on Edward Hartwick. And somewhere I have a copy of it. I hope there was a copy that left at the museum there or at the visitor center when I left. But yeah, it was interesting. He was involved with a lot of things, and so
Mhm.
he was a very outstanding civic leader. And for those who don't know, the Detroit Athletic Club, it wasn't a gym, like we think of today, but it was a social club, a gentleman's club. And yes, they had athletics there. They sponsored their own athletic teams. But it's a very nice, stately building. And if you're ever watching a Tigers game, uh, Comerica Park. It's one of those nice buildings that's off behind the outfield wall there that you can see. One of the first big square blocky building that's right across the street from Comerica Park. It's I've never been inside it. I've loved to be able to get an invite to check it out, but that's the thing. It's members only to see
Mhm.
it. So
Yeah. Yeah. So all of this makes it very interesting that, his businesses are successful, they're well off. He's this man about town, involved in all kinds of things. People know him. And when the United States enters World War I, Edward feels called to get back into the military. He wants to get an officer's commission and not really and join up, essentially. And he has to convince a few different people because by this time he's in his 40s. And today, of course, we're like, so what? But at that time, that was old. And to just decide to kind of switch careers again. And the first person he asks says no, like is not willing to give him a commission because he's too old. And so he has to convince the right person to get a commission. So he finally, I don't know who, but he convinces the right person, probably because he runs in the right circles, knows somebody who knows somebody. And he is commissioned a major. And I can't imagine at this point, the Hartwicks have two young boys. And I can't imagine what that must be like for Karen and what kinds of things she must have had to say to him. Like, we are successful. We have two young kids. What are you doing?
yeah,
Why? Being a mother myself, that would be really a very difficult conversation. Like, he's not being drafted. He's doing this of his own accord, right? So they end up going to DC for training, and the Hartwicks follow him. Karen and their two children go with him, and I think they're there for several months, and eventually they see him off. He goes to New York and boards a ship for France, and that's the last time that they ever see him.
Yeah.
It's because he's commissioned a major in engineers. I am not a military historian.
No, that's
But
fine.
in a unit of engineers. So the things Edward knows about, right? He knows about lumber and lumber adjacent things. So the engineers, they're building bridges and structures and trenches and all that stuff. So he's in charge of one of those units. And also, he's able to convince people to let him back in because he has battle experience and he has leadership battle experience from the Spanish-American War, which during wartime, that's really rare. So even though he's quote unquote old for being in his 40s, that's experience that the military is in need of. So he's in France, and in March 1918, he gets ill. We do not know with what, and all accounts show that he was feeling better, but then things took a very drastic turn. So he gets sick again, at this time with cerebrospinal meningitis. And on Easter Sunday, so in March 1918, he passes away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's very sad, of course. And all of his men have these beautiful things to say about him. So it certainly seems like he was well respected. Some of his men, are saying they look up to him like a father. He berates them for using profanity, just like a dad might with a son. So, very, very well respected, well looked up to. And some of these men, they write letters home to Karen, expressing how sorry they are and sad they are. Teddy Roosevelt writes a letter to Karen giving his condolences. And he is interred at that time. Edward's body stays in France. He is interred in France. A few years later, once the war's over, Karen does go retrieve his body from France and bring it home. And today they are buried next to each other in Detroit in Woodlawn Cemetery. But so now it's the 1920s. Karen is widowed. Her sons are growing, and she is looking for a way to honor his memory, to commemorate him. And at this time, I'm sure there's many statues being erected of people who made that ultimate sacrifice. But that doesn't seem to be something she wants to do. But interestingly enough, she shares a seamstress with a lady named Genevieve Gillette.
That's their connection. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Genevieve Gillette, you could do a whole podcast just about her.
Exactly.
Or an episode about her. She's fabulous. So she's a very early proponent of Michigan conservation, huge proponent of Michigan state parks. She is besties with PJ Hoffmaster. So if you're familiar with Hoffmaster State Park near Grand Rapids, and at Hoffmaster State Park is the Gillette Nature Center. Or maybe it's the Gillette Visitor Center, but anyways, that's the name. So that's so they're friends. They know each other. Hoffmaster is the superintendent or director of state parks. So she's always finding people to donate land to be state parks. So she, in Detroit, shares a seamstress with Karen Hartwick. So I don't know that the two of them ever met face to face, but certainly I'm sure through gossip and chit chat at the seamstress, Karen must say, I'm really looking for a way to honor Edward. And the seamstress shares this juicy tidbit with Genevieve Gillette. And they get connected that way. So I don't know if they ever sat down face to face, like met and chatted about this, or if it was all via letter. I'm not sure. But through Genevieve, she convinces Karen that what you want to do is state park. You want to donate a state park and have it be named after your husband. And that is what she does. So Karen, she purchases a parcel of land that was still owned by her father's logging company. So if you remember back to the beginning, we talked about the Salling and Hanson logging company. They owned and logged the land that is today Hartwick Pines State Park. Karen, she buys this land in today's dollars. I think she pays her own money, about $600,000 for it. And it's about 8,200 acres is what she purchases. And it's all worked out ahead of time, of course, with lawyers. So the day after purchasing it, she deeds it to the state of Michigan.
Good for her.
The name's changed a little bit, but it was Edward E. Hartwick Pines Memorial Park at the time of donation. I can see why they changed the name. That's a terrible mouthful. But and what's a little bit funny is that the company had been trying to sell this land, the same piece of land, to the state.
Yes.
But the state at the time, which I'm sure you'll hear in other episodes, was getting a whole bunch of land for free through tax reversion. So I can't imagine, like, no, we're not going to buy your land. What? So it all ends up working out. And included with this 8,200 acre donation is a parcel of old growth forest, or you might call it virgin forest. So old growth white pine and hemlock, some red pine as well, that had never been logged. So it's this wonderful donation, and she put a few stipulations in the deed. You have to build a logging museum. So that's why we have a logging museum today. You have to build a road so people can get there. So these are things that the state has to do to keep this land to keep this donation. So at the time, I mean, there's probably a railroad track, probably a wagon route, but no actual road proper. So today that road is M93, or also called Hartwick Pines Road. And if you take I-75 to the park, that's the road you're going to drive on. There has to be a memorial building. So you guys can't see it, but my background in this Zoom call is actually the interior of the memorial building. Beautiful log structure built in
I'll
1929.
I'll probably screenshot some of this so people will be able to see some photos.
Okay.
But yeah, so they can see the interior of the memorial building, which unfortunately is not a public building anymore. Or do you have it open for some?
Well, in previous years, we have had a volunteer host program. However, we're probably not having that this summer, in hopes that log restoration is going to begin.
Oh,
some
good.
side log restoration. So it's not like an open all the time building. And unfortunately, this summer, due to fingers crossed that log restoration is going to happen, so the building will be closed. But hopefully, once that restoration gets taken care of, which is badly needed, it'll be open again. But it was the visitor center from 1929 until like 95, 94, 95.
Yeah, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I came to the park in 98, and so it had been closed for 3 years, 4 years at that point. And a couple years later is when we started talking about restoring the building, and it had been placed on the National Register of Historic Places. But here we are now in 2025 and still working on it. So I'm glad that it's still there, and that that sounds very encouraging to me that that there's potential log restoration happening. But yes, it's a fantastic building, and yes, it was a great memorial for Edward Hartwick. But there is, unfortunately, not built to the standards of the 21st century. So needed updates and modern facilities built
Yes.
to replace it. So I'm glad that there's still plans to restore the building, to have it open again, and I'm glad that people get a chance to get inside and see it now and then. That was not something we could do when I was there. A little bit too much bat issues. So
Yeah, and I'll say that when I started in 2016, and I was brought into this building for the first time, the floor was crunchy.
yes.
And you didn't want to breathe the air for very long. I probably shouldn't have gone in that building at all. But with a lot of thanks to our friends group who donated a lot of money, we were able to remove all of the bat guano and who knows what else covered stuff in the building. It was mostly like really old exhibit cases, stuff that couldn't be reused today. All of that was thrown away. We had the building professionally cleaned. I mean, they had scaffolding in there. They were spraying down the ceiling. And then we did have to have an industrial hygienist come and test the air quality and give us that certificate of occupancy.
Oh, good.
So, and we do still have, even though we got a new roof very recently, which is beautiful, cedar shake. And so that really lessened the bat problem, but we do still they sneak in,
That's a lot of people don't realize that when you have buildings in a forest, you're going to get visitors that are not intended to go in there. Mice, they're going to find ways in. Bats, they're going to find ways in. I know we had constant battles with that in the logging museum buildings, and I suspect you still do. So
yes.
And the roofs are looking great at the logging museum when I visited last year. So
yeah, at the same time the memorial building got a new roof, so there are two separate structures that make up the logging museum, and they also got new cedar shake roofs. We also have a small chapel that was built in the 50s along the old growth trail that also got a new cedar shake roof. So roofs are looking great. It's very nice. We're also, along with that exhibit hall renovation, we're also getting a new roof on the visitor center,
Oh, good.
which is badly needed. That's
Yes.
not cedar shake. That'll just be a standard roof, but uh, it's so nice to see upgrades happen.
Yeah.
And oh yeah, so we were talking about the deed. So yeah, Karen put in the deed that we have to have this memorial building. So not only is the whole park a memorial to Edward, there has to be this physical structure that we maintain that is a memorial to him.
Yeah.
And last but certainly not least, we can't cut the trees. And of course, sometimes, usually it's a matter of safety, both for people and structures. We do have to cut trees sometimes. But do we walk into the old growth forest and take our crosscuts on, cut down trees? No, we don't do that. There's no logging happening within the 10,000 acre park. It's just for safety.
And can I add, not only with not removing trees, but also not removing the what comes down on their own from storms,
Yeah.
dying trees.
Mm-hmm.
And I, I do forest history now. That's my specialty since working at Hartwick Pines and learning about how important all that is to the forest. And Craig will touch on that when I talk to him. But yeah, all of that, those logs, those decaying logs on there, that's very important for habitat for wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
It's also puts nutrients back into the soil for regrowth. So yeah, people always wondered why, it's not, all nicely groomed underneath there. It's certainly, yeah, there's going to be litter, debris on the forest floors, but that's natural. That's what's
Yeah.
there. So.
Yep. And we when a tree comes down, if it wasn't dead, if it was an alive tree, maybe it was wind or whatever, it was just its time perhaps, and it falls down, we always have people ask if it's near the trail, like, can I take that log? Can I buy that log? Like, no. No, you can't do that. No, so yeah, for all the reasons you mentioned, no, we don't eradicate what Craig will call coarse woody debris.
Yes, exactly.
That's a term I've learned working with nature folks.
Yeah.
And I will also mention, so that stuff on the forest floor is so good for habitat and ecosystem and all the stuff you mentioned. However, it does kind of increase the fuel load on the forest floor, so that can be bad for fire risk. And that is something we're currently working on internally, is to come up with like a fire management plan. In many places, that's going to look, one of the things you might do is what's called a controlled or a prescribed burn to lessen the fuel load. We don't want to do that at Hartwick Pines.
It would be hard there.
A very important historic forest, important historic structures. We don't want fire anywhere near those. So, at a place like Hartwick Pines, that's going to look like maintaining fire breaks around the perimeter of the park. That probably opening up old fire breaks that the Civilian Conservation Corps first, kind of put into place in the 30s, opening those back up because they haven't all been maintained.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and fire is something that's certainly a topic right now. We're recording this in early January. Everybody here won't be hearing this until mid-February. But right now, there's the wildfires that are going through Southern California right now. So fires are certainly in the news. And yeah, that's something that will get touched on in future episodes of the podcast. Will be wildfires and the connection to the forest, both good and bad. And I will definitely have different people talking about that in the summertime. In August, I'm going to northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota. I want to hit Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and Hinckley, Minnesota. Both have fire museums of major wildfires that burned in those areas. So I'll get experts from other locations to chime in on the wildfires.
Yeah, and it's Hartwick Pines, where we're at in Grayling. We're surrounded by a lot of jack pine country. it just naturally grows there, but also a lot of it has been planted for Kirtland warbler habitat. And so I don't want to get too off topic here, but just to give an idea of, we are, I think, especially fire-minded at Hartwick Pines because of our location. Jack pine is very fire prone. So
Yes.
if it's super hot and dry, also Camp Grayling, which is a military National Guard base, is kind of all around us in the Grayling area, and their bombing range is super close to Hartwick Pines. So that is also another fire concern when you have live artillery nearby. So if you do come visit and it's a bright, sunshiny summer day and you think you hear thunder, it's not thunder. It's Camp Grayling.
I want to kind of circle back a little bit, though. Talked about the creation of the park and with Karen Hartwick and Edward Hartwick, but you barely touched on about the old growth that survived. Can you tell us a little bit about how that survived? Because that's what's unique, is to have that,
Yeah.
because most places, all that big pine was cut.
Mhm. Yeah, this, of course, the white pine was worth a whole lot of money. But when the Salling and Hanson company was logging at what's today Hartwick Pines State Park, there was a nationwide recession in 1893. It's called the Panic of 93. We don't really learn about it anymore in school because we learn about the Great Depression, which, so not many people are familiar with the Panic of 93, but it was a nationwide recession, quite bad. So nobody had money to buy their lumber, so they halted their logging operation. And it's very interesting, actually. There is a part of the old growth trail. You can stand on the trail, and on one side of you is fairly new growth. I mean, it's like 100 years old now, but new-ish, using quotes, forest on one side of you, hardwood forest, and on the other side of you is old growth. And so you can really stand right on that line where they halted their cutting operation in 1893. And there was 85, 86-ish acres left that they hadn't cut. And but they owned a whole lot. They did not own just this tiny little, a dinky parcel, like 100 acres. They owned thousands and thousands of acres. So when they come back to resume their logging operation, the economy's improved, people are buying lumber again. They don't want to cut 80 acres. It's not going to make them enough money. They would have had to probably relay their narrow gauge railroad track. They might have had to rebuild some of their logging camp structures. That's a lot of investment, and it's simply not worth it to get the money from 80 acres of trees. So they moved just a little bit northwest, maybe, build a new camp, maybe, I don't know, what do you think, Rob, mile and a half?
About that, yeah.
Like that.
Northeast, about a mile and a half, 2 miles. Northwest, I mean. Yeah.
And build a new camp, and they start cutting I've heard it was 8,000 acres of forest.
Yeah.
So we go from 80, little dinky 80 acres of old growth to 8,000 acres of white pine. So you can see clearly that's the better choice. They made, the better economic choice there. But they still owned this land. So they still owned this land, mostly cut over. However, there's this little section of 80 some acres. There's a few other things going on with these trees as well. They're at the time probably smaller than the trees on the 8,000 acres that they're cutting. Also, and I have seen this myself, some of these white pines have this very interesting pink red tinge to the grain. And I've seen one of our logs get cut in our sawmill. We have a small sawmill by the logging museum. And today, gorgeous wood. Oh man, to have a wall in your house with this beautiful, like pinkish tinged white pine, it would be so gorgeous. But back in the 1800s, 1890s, we want white, creamy white pine. That's what people are paying for. So it's kind of defective. So there are probably multiple reasons, not just that it was 80 acres. That's the main one, though. Uh, and fast forward to when Karen is acquiring this land, of course, that's a huge bonus. She's not buying cut over, 8,000 acres of cut over land. She's buying this because that old growth forest is there. So that's really kind of the draw. That's the attraction. And local people knew about this place and were enjoying the old growth forest way before it was a state park. Mm-hmm. Remember, the name of the logging company is the Salling and Hanson Logging Company. So local people call it Hanson Pines. And if you're familiar with Grayling, you probably recognize that name. Hanson Hills, for example, Hanson Game Refuge. So he's very well known in the community, donates a lot of his land, owned, to talk about Camp Grayling again, he donated land to Camp Grayling. So people call it Hanson Pines. They're going out there for their picnics. It's hard to imagine today with how densely forested northern Michigan is. But if you can imagine, it's like 1920 and it's a hot summer day and you want to have a shady picnic. And if you live in Grayling, there's only one place to go. And it is Hanson Pines. So everybody knew about it. People, even though the logging company still owned it, clearly they had no issues with the public going on this land and hiking through the forest, utilizing that space. So when it becomes a state park, at least for the locals, I don't think a whole much changed except for access. A road was built, so now they can get there easier.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the road to come up to it at that time was going up through the Jones Lake Road and then up through what's Bobcat Trail today. And of course, parts of that is paved now. But at that time, that was all sandy two-track. I mean, Jones Lake Road had only recently been a railroad line at that point. So, so yeah, it was definitely difficult to get up to there at that point. And yeah, does the visitors?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, does the visitor center still have the panoramic photo showing the old growth as basically an island of pines in an area completely cut over? I think that photo was 1926. I know the original is now down at the State Archives or somewhere in Lansing, but before it went down there, I remember getting some copies of it made. And so we were able to get the framed copy to hang in the visitor center. But yeah, that's really, amazing to see that, yes, truly, this was something that there was no other forest around there, or the trees that you see in there were kind of in the swampy areas all around the Osable River, the East Branch. But otherwise, yeah, there was nothing. And it was truly something special.
Oh, yeah. So was prized by locals, while it was still owned by the logging company, and then it becomes a state park and more widely publicized. So then, of course, in the 30s, you start having car culture, road trip culture, and then I'm sure a different episode, but the Civilian Conservation Corps building, they built our first bathroom building. They built picnic tables, grills, hiking trails, the first campground at Hartwick Pines. So now you could come camp here and cook your food. You can use the bathroom and hike some trails. And they built the logging museum as well. So lots of cool CCC history at the park as well. Yeah.
And I had a chance to preside over the dedication of the CCC statue there. And I think it was 2006 or 2007. And that was really neat to have that happen. The local CCC alumni chapter that was dissolving because they had so few members left. And they had money, and so they wanted to buy a statue there. And of course, as you know, the very first CCC statue in the United States is at North Higgins Lake State Park at the CCC Museum
Yay.
there. And then the Hartwick Pine statue was something like number 52 or something. And I think they're in the 70s or
Mhm.
80s now. Phil Nod, mutual friend of ours who is involved with the CCC, he definitely knows that. And he will be a guest when I do the CCC. I think I'll do a couple of episodes on that and have him and Bill Jamerson, who we also know, who performs and was a
Yeah.
documentarian on the CCC. He'll also talk too. So people will have to continue to listen to the podcast to learn about this. So that's season 2,
Yeah.
which will air sometime later in 2025. I don't have a schedule yet. But so
Awesome.
yes, the CCC was important in the history of of the the park as well. And that's the one thing, is that I loved working at Hartwick Pines. I mean, it shaped me as the historian I am today. And yes, this is an area of history that is something that most people don't really think about. I remember learning, logging history, or Michigan with the lumberjacks in Michigan history class in high school. We didn't learn it in elementary school like they do now. But and then being a history major at Eastern Michigan University, I did take a Michigan history class as well, and so that kind of got me started. Well, but it wasn't until I um, interviewed for the job for Hartwick Pines in 1998, and I was working as a seasonal at the Walker Tavern Historic Site, another one of our field sites for the state of Michigan. That My supervisor at the time, who was chief of the Lower Peninsula field sites, told me about the Hartwick Pines availability, and so I started boning up on lumber history, and I learned most of it then being on the job there at
Mhm.
Hartwick, which I suspect you have learned a lot on the job as well. And
Yes.
I know we've been in communication over the years, so if you have questions, you will ask me at times, and I'm always happy to help. Being that although you're starting to catch up to my tenure, you're there, what, 8 years now? So
That'll be
or
9 years in
nine
May.
years, yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so yeah, so I was 15, and my predecessor was there 4, and no, 2 years. I'm sorry, 96 to 98, and then your
Okay.
predecessor was only about that same amount, I think, too. So
Only I think like a year, I think. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah,
Mhm.
but we're all still, I don't know if you're still living in the shadows of, but I was, of Wendell Hoover, who was the
Mhm.
interpreter for the park. He was the naturalist, started in the 1960s, and they did not have a historian until he left in 1995. And
Yeah.
then Will Shapton, the first historian, took over. His position was basically split between the natural resources, having the park naturalist, and at that time the museum was of a different agency. We were Department of State, then Department of History, Arts and Libraries, and now back in the DNR. And but
Mhm.
the position was split in 1996, and
Yeah.
so I was the
Yeah.
second. You're the fourth of the historians there. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. And it's yeah, Hartwick Pines is an interesting state park operationally because kind of what you were touching on. Uh, I work for the DNR, but when you think state park, you think Parks and Rec, you think Parks and Recreation, park rangers. We have a park supervisor. We actually have 2 of them. Several park rangers. You think campground, right? Checking into the campground, that stuff. But at Hartwick Pines, we also have me, so the Michigan History Center. We have a presence there, and then we also have marketing and outreach division, which is like the education side of the DNR. So that's our park interpreter, Craig, who is responsible for kind of the natural history side of things. And so it's a very interesting place to work. And I deal with things I think my other colleagues, history colleagues, don't have to deal with because I work so closely with a naturalist and, parks and recreation folks. So I don't see my museum and history colleagues down in Lansing very often.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a very interesting park. And I think, the public, you see State Park and you just think we're all the same and we all kind of do the same job, but we all do really different things. But we have to work closely together to make it make a great experience for the public.
Yeah, and I think that really helped me professionally. It really expanded my view. I wasn't just
Hmm.
talking about the logging. I was talking about the forest as a whole. And of course you see that too, but then add into it that the position included overseeing the Civilian Conservation Corps Museum at North Higgins Lake State Park. And the CCC was really about, well, for the most part in Michigan at least, all about reforestation. And
Hmm.
again, we'll talk about that in future episodes. And I definitely know I'll have you on for other episodes here in the future,
Hmm.
uh, so we can touch about a lot of different subjects. But that yeah, the CCC did so much to bring our forests back to what we have today. And as I mentioned to you off camera or before I started recording, one of the previous episodes, and the listeners have been able to hear it now, is Birth of Reforestation. And I center on the start of the reforestation at Higgins Lake in 1903, 1904, and the Beale Plantation there in Grayling in even earlier in the 1880s. And so you had logging still taking place at Hartwick Pines or the area here, the Salling Hanson Company, in operation in the 1880s, the 1890s. Um, I think I'll do an episode on the Salling Hanson Company as well at some point, and particularly Nels Mickelson. He's somebody that I actually did first person interpretive programs of Nels at times, and he's a very interesting person. And for people who don't know
Hmm.
it, uh, after the after he retired from logging, and his daughter Karen Hartwick was living in Detroit. Some of his sons had moved to the Detroit area. He did too, and he actually built a mansion in the I guess it was the late teens, and it is in what's called the Boston Edison Historic District of Detroit, in the neighborhood. It's better known by a later owner of it. It's called the Gordy Mansion, Barry Gordy Mansion, because Barry Gordy, the founder of Motown Records, lived in the home
Yeah.
for a long time. So he had, like many others of the lumbermen, they had so many different interests. So the Salling Hanson Company, Nels Mickelson, you know, they had their heyday in the 1880s, the 1890s, early 1900s. But there was also all of this understanding that, okay, these forests aren't lasting as long as we originally thought. We need to do something to reforest, and the fire's coming through. So having you on today, Hillary, has really helped reinforce a lot of what we want to talk about here. But so you did cover a bit that I was going to ask you of what's going on this year with you're talking about some of the work being done at the park, but and coming up soon, there's going to be some snowshoe hikes, and yes, actually, the January one you mentioned will have been passed by this point, but this is going to air February 17th, so February 22nd, the snowshoe hike, if there's enough snow, people will be able to come up for that one. So yes,
Yep, and you do need to register for those if you're listening to this on February 22nd in a couple days. You can go to our Facebook, go to our events tab. You can find the February 22nd guided snowshoe hike. There's a link there to register. And then I think the next big thing would be our maple syrup day. That is April 12th. Whenever the weather calls for it here, we'll be tapping trees. And then on April 12th, we'll boil down our sap and kind of a whole day of tapping demonstrations and different maple syrup info if you're interested in tapping trees at your house. And then oh, let's see what's happening this summer. I kind of mentioned our daily programming starting mid-June or so, pretty much every day there's something going on, whether that's a guided hike or uh, laundry day at the logging museum, blacksmithing. They always got something going on. And Our big event, well, of course, we have Forest Fest. That is in August, and that is fun. You usually get to meet Smokey Bear, a little Smokey Bear photo op, and get your junior. So that's a very family-friendly event. If you have kiddos, super fun to come get some Smokey Bear swag and do some different kid-oriented activities at the visitor center and at the log museum. And let me pull up a calendar. I can tell you what day that will be. That will be August 9th this year. And then our really big festival is Black Iron Days. Our friends group operates the steam engine and sawmill I mentioned previously. Tons of artisans come in, blacksmiths. Depends on the year. There's usually some woodworkers. Sometimes there's a broom maker, a person that does pottery, all kinds of things. Super fun. And that's all weekend. And that's going to be August 23rd and 24th in 2025.
Do you still have the steam engine
And
operating then? Or
yes, so
the sawmill?
that will be happening during Black Iron
Good.
Days. Yes. If you're listening and you're familiar with the park, there is a different festival that typically occurs in July that will not be happening this year.
Oh,
So I won't even mention its name. I don't want to confuse people. But if you're like, hey, she forgot to mention that, like, no, it's not. That's not going to happen this year. But if you are coming, check our Facebook, give us a call. I mentioned there is going to be some construction going on at the visitor center. There might be times where we have to close sections of the building. We don't quite know yet. We don't have dates yet. We don't know how it's going to affect operations. So, there might be days where like the front door has to be closed because they're working on the roof. But, we'll have updates, all that on our Facebook.
Yeah. Sounds like an exciting time there. I came there shortly after the visitor center opened, just 3 years later. But yet the exhibit hall, some of it was never completed. And I know there was a bare wall, at least still in 2013 when I left. I don't know if that continued to be the case, but yes, no, that's great to see that there's going to be some updating at the visitor center there. It's wow, we're talking 30 years now since it's opened, 1995. So it's
Yeah, and we still, even though, internally we're like, oh man, these exhibits, but we still have visitors that come and they're like, oh, your exhibit hall's
yeah,
amazing. So, just to let the public know that the life of a permanent, what we would call a permanent museum exhibit, is going to be anywhere from 20 to 30 years.
yeah,
So this exhibit is at the end of its life. It is 30 years old and it's time for many reasons. Many things are broken, missing, or were never completed in the first place. So, yeah, we did, and we did recently receive some monies to help complete the exhibit hall. So,
good.
it is really going to happen. I know, Rob,
Yeah,
having worked for the state in the past, you know how it goes. Sometimes you think things are going to happen and they don't, but
yeah.
it is going to happen. And we have been working, we've already did the bulk of the design with an outside exhibit firm. They are going to be so beautiful and so awesome.
Yeah.
So
Last thing I want to ask you, and this is something I'm going to ask all of my guests on the show, so I want to kind of make it the trademark of here, is uh, what does the forest, or how does the forest make you feel? Not specifically Hartwick Pines, but just forests in general. What when you go into a forest, does it make you feel any different than, walking on a city sidewalk or anything?
I've been thinking about this, and I think for me, forests make me feel at home. And I might have to describe that because I didn't grow up hunting and fishing, but I'm from Munising in the UP on Lake Superior, and uh, I grew up playing in the woods behind my grandma's house, playing in the woods across the street from my own house, with friends. Everything's really builds your curiosity, like, picking up sticks and, ooh, what's under this pile of wet leaves, and all of that stuff, climbing over logs and building a fort as best as a like 6-year-old can do. Especially I grew up with Picture Docks National Lakeshore being in my backyard, so spent a ton of time on the beach. But if you're familiar with that area, it's forested with beach. It's not like, I don't know. If you grew up like on a coast, maybe it's a little different. But and now I live in St. Agnes. We have a ton of cedar here, which of course cedar is sacred to the Anishinaabe, and so there's something quite, an at-home feeling. It's that smell, the smell of fresh water and cedar and evergreen, and just a little bit spiritual, I guess, as well. So yeah, I think I feel at home in a forest probably in a different way that like an outdoorsman would, right? Because I didn't grow up hunting, fishing, trapping, that kind of lifestyle. But I still, I've lived in cities, and it's literally and figuratively a breath of fresh air when I come home.
Yeah.
To see trees, right?
Great answer. I grew up in a small town, but close to metropolitan areas. Chelsea, we're 15 miles from Ann Arbor, but just outside of Chelsea is the Waterloo Recreation Area, one of the state parks, state recreation areas that we have here in the Lower Peninsula. So I had that in my backyard. Not a national park, but not one that isn't too shabby. And then my family, we have a cabin, 40-acre property in Alcona County, about 60 miles from Grayling. And so it was nice for me to get away over there when I lived in Grayling. And that's in the middle of the Huron National Forest. So I had a lot of that, but that's a hunting and fishing cabin. I grew up with that. I'm not a hunter. I'm the only male in our family who didn't take to it. I've got nothing against hunting. I just couldn't do it myself, but I like to fish and I like to be out in the woods. I was a backpacker for a long time before my knees and back and started to give me trouble. But so yeah, I get that feeling. I don't have the cultural connection there that you have, but certainly it's a lovely place. And thank you for that. And yeah, I just kind of want to get the feel for people, what they think about this, because I think a lot of people don't put forests into, we take it for granted that we have it and it's a place to provide lumber, and it's a place to take a walk out there to kind of clear your mind. But think about it, how it affects you deeply. And that's part of why I've wanted to do this podcast for a couple of years now. And because it's something that we don't take for granted of what we have here in the Great Lakes region, not just in Michigan. I will cover Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ontario, but also other areas too. Last thing I want to mention to you, I visited in October. I went out east a little bit, and there's a place there called Cook Forest State Park in Northwest Pennsylvania, north of the city of Clarion. And it is very similar history to Hartwick Pines. It's larger. They had over 600 acres of old growth pine that survived, but it was from lumbering in the during the similar time period. They started in the 1860s, I believe. There, originally looking at a canal to go through, but the lumber industry kind of ended there in the 80s. But same time, 1920s, the heir to the family that owned the property was looking to create a park, and he also wanted to sell the land to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and they did buy the land in part, but they created basically a friends group that raised money to do most of the purchase of the land there. And that's something that if you ever get a chance to out in that region of Pennsylvania, northwest of it, it's I think as a fellow forest historian, you would certainly love to visit there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And um, I'll mention as well, I also, yeah, definitely don't take forest for granted. And my dad was a forester for the Hiawatha National Forest for like 35
oh,
years. That
okay.
was his career. So, yeah, he was a forester and a timber sale administrator. So, modern logging literally put food on the table for me
Yeah.
growing up. Um, Helped me go to college, right? So, uh, I am very appreciative of forests and all the things they do for us, and all the ways they can provide for us.
Well, thanks for attending. Thanks for being on this today, Hillary. We did go a little bit long, but I certainly did not want to cut any of this. We interpreters, we can be long-winded, but we
Yeah.
had a lot of great information here today. And I really want to thank you for being on the episode here. And I'm definitely going to talk to you in the future. I want to learn more about the Learning Commons at Gitche, Michike de Minising, heart of the
Yeah.
Great Turtle Island, and I know that's at Strait State Park.
Mhm.
That's the what has been known currently as the Father Marquette National Memorial, correct?
Mhm. Yep, Father
Yeah,
Marquette National Memorial, and that is not changing. So that if a little pavilion, that's the memorial,
yeah.
that will still be there. That will still be the memorial to Father Marquette. Just the whole site on that side of I-75 is being renamed Gitche Michike Diminishing, or Heart of the Great Turtle Island. And that is not a name that we, the state DNR, came up with. That is a name that was come up in collaboration with tribal partners.
Good. Yeah, I that's an area of the forest history I want to touch on that I am certainly for the most part ignorant about. I did spend one summer working for the Mackinac Island Historic Parks back in 1988, so a long time ago, and so I certainly want to touch more on the Native American, the indigenous peoples' view of
Mhm.
forests, and so that's something that we'll talk about again in the future. But thanks a lot again today, Hillary, for being on the podcast. And I'll be up visiting Hartwick Pines soon. Actually, later this week, as we're airing this, I'll be up on Wednesday through Friday. So I'll try to make it out to, I know I'll make it out to the park if there's enough snow to be snowshoeing. And I might bring my skis with me. So if you're around, but I know you're up in St. Ignace for a good portion of your time. But if you're there, then I'll see you then. If not, another time I'm up because I think I owe you lunch for doing this. So thank you again to Hillary Pines for appearing on this week's episode. Next week, we'll stay at Hartwick Pines State Park and speak with Craig Casmer, the park's interpreter naturalist, about the wildlife of the forests of Michigan and the Great Lakes. As always, if you enjoyed this, please tell a friend. It's the best way to expand the podcast to more listeners. Thank you again for listening to the North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forests of the Great Lakes region. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.